Hey everyone, in this video and the next few videos in this series, we'll be building this application from scratch. It's packed with smooth animations and interactive icons, all powered by Rive. The app features custom sidebar and a custom bottom tab bar. In this first part, we'll focus on building the onboarding UI and a custom sign-in model from scratch. We'll also include validation feedback using animated Rive assets, showing error or success animations, and even a confetti explosion on successful sign-in. Before we dive in, huge thanks to the original creator of the app, Design Plus Code. This project is inspired by the Swift UI plus Rive course created by Mangto. In the course, he walks through building the same app using Swift UI and also teaches how to create your own custom Rive assets using the Rive editor. It's completely free and includes both videos and articles. I'll drop the link in the description. Highly recommend checking it out. Alright, let's get started. I've already set up the base Ionic Angular application using standalone components and capacitor. To render the Rive assets, we're using a community package called ng-rive. I've also prepared all the necessary assets, icons, images, Rive files, and fonts. In our variables.scss file, we define the theme colors, font families, and different font variants. To ensure our app covers the full screen, rendering behind the status and navigation bar, we set the overlay web view to true for Android, at least for the older devices. This is already the default behavior on iOS. First, let's generate a new page called course-rive. We delete the default home directory and remove its route. We also update the app routes to redirect to the new page. Now let's create a views folder and generate an onboarding page inside it. And remove the auto-created entry in the app routes as we won't need it. I'm renaming the component selector to CR onboarding, where CR stands for course Rive. This naming convention isn't required, but I'm going to follow the same for all the components that we're going to create. Since we're using standalone components, we need to import all the required Angular components and modules manually. So I'm just going to import them all at once that we're going to need for this component. Let's replace the default HTML with an empty div. Now to see the UI, we need to import our onboarding component into the root with other necessary imports. It's obviously throwing an error because we have removed their imports, so we're just going to replace the root component's HTML with our CR onboarding tag. Now for the Rive setup, in man.ts, we need to provide the path for our Rive assets. Since our assets live in a custom folder, we specify that path here. Rive also needs Angular's HTTP client to load the assets. So we need to also add that as a provider, and finally add the required imports from the package in onboarding. Our first Rive asset is called Shapes, a background animation of floating shapes. The animation type is loop, so it keeps playing unless we stop it manually. The Design Plus Code course already explains how to create this in detail, so definitely check it out if you're curious. To render it, we use the canvas component from the Rive package, specifying the file name in the Rive property and state machine via Rive animation tag. It doesn't show anything, so we set the animation to autoplay. We want the canvas to fill the entire screen, so we use Ionic's platform service to get screen dimensions and pass them as canvas width and height. And it looks much better. Next, we blur this background by adding a Rive-bg class with a CSS blur filter. And behind that, we add a spline background with absolute positioning. Right now, it is covering the screen's width, so to enlarge it, I'm going to add a fixed width of 840 pixels, which is just 1.5 times its original width. And now to shift this to the center horizontally, we can add left of -50% and right of 0. Next, translate X and Y to move it to the bottom right. And finally, a blur filter similar to the shapes view, as they are only working as a background. Now to the main content, we add a content container div with absolute positioning, top and bottom 0, and with 100% to cover the whole screen and show on top of these backgrounds. Next, let's add the title. Right now, it's showing behind the notch, so we'll give the container safe area top padding with some extra space, around 80 pixels. Then, we will set the title color to black, font size to 60 pixels, and font family to Poppins Bold. We'll also wrap it in a title class to set a max width of 260 pixels. That's because the width doesn't apply directly on the text element for some reason. and we want the text to look consistent across all devices. After that, we'll add a subtitle, styled using the body font variation from our global theme. We'll give it a slightly dim color in CSS and a bit of top margin for spacing. Lastly, let's also add a padding of 40 pixels on the container. Below that, we add another Rive asset for a button with a fixed width and height of 236 and 64 pixels. Inside that, Rive player tag with animation name, play, mode of one shot, and along with that, auto reset to reset the animation after a trigger. Now if you're wondering where this fixed value of width and height came from, this is how it's specified in the Rive editor for this animation. This animation smoothly scales the button along with the border animation, and unlike the shapes animation we saw earlier, this animation is of type one shot, meaning it only plays once per trigger. We wrap this with an Ionic button container and add text start the course and an arrow icon to show on top. Now the icon is not visible because we need to define them in the component to load them correctly. So for simplification, we're just going to define all the icons we will be needing for this app in the root app component using add icons from Ion icons package, and now it's visible. Now let's overlay the text and icon on top of the Rive button animation. We'll use CSS grid for that, and to keep everything aligned within the same space, we'll set both the grid row and column to 1 for the child elements. Then we'll style the button text, set the color, font weight, and a Z index of 1 to make sure it shows above the button background. We'll also center the text using the text align center. At this point, the container is still stretching across the full width. So let's match its max width and height to the button asset. We'll size the icon next and use flex properties to center everything inside the button. Then a little spacing and alignment for the text. It's still a bit off center visually because of the extra space taken up by the orange background behind the button. So we'll tweak it slightly using translate X and translate Y to center it perfectly on top. Finally, let's add some shadow beneath the button. We'll create another div, give it the same content class, and also apply a shadow class for styling. Set its background and height to 100% so it matches the button. Then move it slightly downward to create the illusion of box shadow. We'll add a blur to soften it and set its Z index to -1 so it appears behind the button. Lastly, let's add some vertical margin around the button for spacing and set the cursor to pointer since it's clickable. Next, add the footer text using the footnote font variation from our global theme and apply the same dim color as the subtitle. To move the button and the footer down to the bottom of the screen, we'll use a spacer div with flex 1, but that alone won't work. We also need to set the container to display flex and add flex direction to column. Then we'll add a padding bottom of 40 pixels along with safe area inset support for devices with notches and set overflow Y to scroll. This ensures the layout is scrollable on smaller devices with limited vertical space. Now we want the button to trigger an animation when clicked. So we'll define a button toggle variable in the component and set its default value to false. Then we create a function called start course pressed where we set the button toggle to true. In the HTML we bind this variable to the play property of Rive player using two-way binding. And we call the function on the button's click event. But there's a problem. If play is false by default, the button won't render initially. It only shows after it's clicked, which is when the variable is set to true. So we try setting it to true, but now the animation won't replay on click. Now quick disclaimer here. The Rive package we're using isn't official. It's a community package that isn't actively maintained at the time of this recording. It works well overall, but there are few quirks. And one of those quirks is with one-shot animation. They don't always trigger reliably. So we'll use a workaround, a way to reset the animation. We declare a new variable called showRiveButton and render the Rive player only if this value is true. Then we set the showRiveButton to true in ngOnInit so the button appears when the component loads. Next, we create a function called resetButtonState. This sets button toggle to false and then briefly hides and shows the Rive player using 100 millisecond timeout. This effectively resets the animation because the player is removed and re-added to the DOM, which wouldn't be visible to the user. In start course pressed, we call this reset function. But it doesn't quite work yet because the toggle is being set to false too early. So we add a delay before resetting the toggle. And now the animation plays again as expected. It still doesn't trigger properly on the first load. So we'll also call reset button state function in ng on init. One last issue. When the button toggle is initially false, the animation canvas won't show. To fix this, we delay the initial load slightly with a timeout, and now it behaves correctly. It's a bit of a hack, but until the package improves, this workaround does the job. Now let's move on to the sign-in model. First, generate a sign-in component. Change the selector to CR sign-in and import all the required modules we'll be using. Then, in the onboarding component, import this new component and render it inside the Ionic model. To display the model, we get its reference and show it after the button animation is completed. Inside the onboarding component, wrap the layout in an Ion page class and center the content. Next, in the sign-in component, add a container div followed by a title using large title font variation from our global theme. Below that, add a subtitle with the headline font style. To break it into two lines, wrap the second line in a p tag. In CSS, center align the text, apply padding 30 pixels to the container, and add vertical spacing to the subtitle. Next, create a title for the email input field using the subheadline font variation and a secondary color from our global theme. Align it to the start. Add an input of type email. It won't display correctly on its own, so we wrap it in an Ion item with a class called input container. In CSS, we set the border, background color to white, a border radius, and some padding at the start. The CSS variables with double hyphens are Ionic specific style properties used to customize the component appearance. Now let's add an icon to the input and set its width and height in CSS. For the input field itself, we add padding, set the text color to black, and align the text to the start. Let's also reduce the input gap with the title. Repeat the same for the password input field as well. Next, we add a sign-in button, use the headline font variation, and set the expand property to block so it spans the full width, and an arrow icon beside the text. In CSS, we customize the background color, but it still uses default styles for the click. So we provide separate styles for the hover and active states. Then, apply padding, set the border radius 8 pixels on the top left and 20 pixels on the remaining corners, and add a box shadow. Finally, add vertical margin and a small gap between the icon and the text. Below the button, insert an OR separator. Then wrap it in an Ionic row and place divider divs on each side of the text. In CSS, set the background color, height to 1 pixel and flex to 1 so the dividers can fill the available space. Align everything using justify content space around and align items center. Style the OR text with a dim color and add horizontal margin of 8 pixels. Add a bottom margin of 40 pixels to the button above to create a spacing between it and the OR separator. Now add a title for the social login section using the secondary font color and vertical margin of 24 pixels. Then insert 3 social icons for email, Apple, and Google. Inside another Ionic row, use justify content space between for layout and specify the icon widths and heights in CSS. Now to complete the modal styling, we need to show the content area with border and shadow, while the rest of the background will be transparent. We wrap the content inside a gradient border div to simulate a frosted glass effect. In CSS, apply margin 16 pixels, a box shadow, border radius, border, and a white linear gradient as the background. It may not be visible at first, but this is consistent with the original SwiftUI app. To preview the effect, you can temporarily change the gradient to red and green. It currently covers the full container, but we want the gradient to appear only on the border. To fix this, apply a transparent background and a backdrop filter of blur to the child sign-in container. Also using the supports rule to ensure the browser supports these CSS features. If the content spills past the border radius, apply the same radius to the child container, but subtract the border width to keep the effect consistent. Now that we know how it looks like, we can change the gradient colors back to white. Finally, let's add a close button to dismiss the model. Use an Ionic button with a close icon, which has some default styles that we will override. Wrap it in a closed container div and set its position to absolute. Set left and right to 0 to center it and give it a top margin of 8 pixels. Change the button background to white using Ionic CSS variable and style the icon with a black color and a fixed width and height of 24 pixels. Also provide alternate background colors for hover and active states. Remove the button's default padding, set its width and height to 36 pixels and apply a border radius of 18 pixels. Finally, add a shadow and that completes the close button setup. Now we'll add input validation using Rive animation from the community. This animation includes 3 inputs: check, error, and reset. You can find similar animations on the Rive marketplace and preview them directly on the site. For this one, we have the error and check animations, and to reset it back to the loader, we have reset input. Next, in the HTML, we'll use a canvas with a file name check and a fixed size of 100 pixels. We'll also specify the state machine name and define all 3 inputs in the component. By default, the canvas renders within the sign-in layout, so we wrap it inside a container div with absolute positioning, where top, bottom, left, and right set to 0 to have it cover whole sign-in container area. Use flex styles to center it. As the canvas appears behind the input, apply a Z index of 1, and it's also conflicting with the touch, so set pointer events to none to prevent any interaction interference. In the component, define variables for email, password, and isLoading. Bind email and password to their respective input fields. We'll hide the check canvas unless isLoading is true. Now create a sign-in function that accepts 3 parameters: success, failure, and reset. These are our state inputs. In the HTML, assign references to each input to trigger them individually. Then trigger the sign-in function on button click, passing in the 3 inputs. Inside the function, set isLoading to true right away. Then check if both fields are non-empty. After a short timeout, about 1 second, we trigger either the success or failure animation based on the validation result. It works, but it doesn't automatically hide. To handle that, we wait another 2 seconds, then set isLoading to false to hide the canvas and reset the animation. It's working as expected now. Next, if validation succeeds, we'll show a Confetti animation. This uses another community Rive asset with a single input, trigger explosion. Like before, we set up a canvas in the HTML, this time with a dimension of 1500 pixels, and provide the state machine and input reference. Add the reference in our sign-in function and trigger the animation if the input is valid. It seems to be conflicting with the check animation, as it is working after timeout, but loader animations are not showing. So we will give it absolute positioning as well. Now both animations work without issue. Next, let's wire up the modal closing functionality. Add an output property called onClose to the sign-in component and emit it when the close button is clicked. In the onboarding component, listen for this callback and dismiss the modal when it's received. Optionally, after a successful validation, we can auto-close the modal and clear the input fields. The sign-in modal is now functionally complete, but we can make it look more like a modal. Set the max modal width to 600 pixels and background color to transparent. Set the backdrop color using color shadow variable from our global theme. Now this looks much better. As I mentioned earlier, the Rive package we're using does comes with a few limitations. One of the issues you might notice is that sometimes the assets don't render properly when multiple Rive animations are loaded at the same time. For example, if I reopen the app, the shapes animation might not appear, and the button animation might fail to load as well. To work around this, we'll declare a boolean variable called showRiveAsset and conditionally render the Rive canvas only if it's true. Then, during component initialization, we'll load these assets with a short delay. We'll apply a similar delay for the button animation, but stagger it slightly so there is a gap between the two render times. Now, if we reopen the app, the animations load much more reliably. Again, this is just a workaround, and ideally it won't be necessary once this is fixed from the package. But for now, this helps keeps things stable. Now let's customize the modal animation. By default, Ionic models animate from bottom to top. We'll change that to animate from top to bottom, and also animate the onboarding content at the same time. We do this by setting the enter animation property on the model. The function receives a reference to the model's base element. To animate, we use animation controller from Ionic and define it in the constructor. Get the root element and create a new animation. Target the model wrapper. This uses a built-in class name applied to the model's wrapper element. Next, use keyframes to animate the models. At offset 0, translate it up by 100% of the viewport height. At offset 1, bring it back to translate y of 0 means it is visible on the screen. Also animate opacity from 0.5 to 1. Now to make the animations work, we need to return animation reference in the function which take base element as the main element. Set animation easing, duration, and add animation to group animations. And it seems to be working. You can also animate the backdrop. Use the from_to method to animate individual style properties. Here, we will animate its opacity from 0.01 to the standard backdrop opacity, as this is a built-in CSS variable used by Ionic. Add this to the animation group and return it. Now the enter animation works, but on exit, it still slides down. To reverse that, set the leave animation property to manipulate model's leave animation. In this function, we reuse the enter animation result and call direction reverse. That gives us a clean top to bottom entry and exit for the model. To animate the onboarding content along with the model, assign it an ID of container.
Then get its reference in the component.
And add a slight upward translate y of minus 50 pixels animation when the model appears. Add that to the animation list, and it works beautifully. Now let's make sure everything looks good in the dark mode.
As you can see, we need a few adjustments to support the dark mode for both onboarding and sign-in UI. So in the HTML, let's add a main container class to the root element. Then in the CSS, we'll force the background to white.
For the sign-in model, we can provide dark mode color overrides for the text and background in our global theme file. This makes the UI consistent across both light and dark modes. For the OR divider, set text and divider colors that also adjust in dark mode. Everything looks great now.
Let's also test the sign-in submission flow just to make sure everything works well with dark mode enabled.
Finally, let's make sure the layout works well on the larger devices. On desktop, you may notice the spline background shifts too far left.
Let's inspect how the spline background behaves across breakpoints. And yes, it shifts too far to the left as we resize the window. And applying the margin auto seems to fix it. Also make sure we apply the same correctly in the HTML.
The sign-in model also needs adjustment at wider breakpoints.
It starts breaking the layout once the screen width crosses 768 pixels, mainly affecting height and introducing an unwanted shadow. To fix this, we'll use a media query to force 100% height and remove the shadow beyond that breakpoint. And now the layout stays consistent whether we expand or shrink the window. Aside from that, everything else works fine.
And with that, our onboarding and sign-in experience is complete. Responsive, animated, dark mode ready, and working across mobile and desktop. In the next video, we'll build the custom bottom tab bar using animated icons from Rive and design the main home screen UI. So stay tuned and I'll see you in the next one.